Hey guys, it's Divest. Today I wanted to talk about the depictions of pagan gods in modern media. So I have been thinking about paganism a lot, especially Greek mythology recently. I realized that beyond my classes currently focusing on the subject, it's just so influential it appears in media directly or you can find a connection to it easily. The natural world is largely named after the gods, here in the West at least the oceans, volcanoes, the planets, the days of the week, etc. So it's pretty inescapable. So when I first conceived of this script, I thought I would just talk about how well I think the artwork for the gods in Age of Mythology looked. I was only going to talk about the 4 civilizations, really 3 as the Atlanteans use Greek mythology. Since I don't know much about Japanese or Chinese mythology, I was going to avoid discussing them. But as I started writing, I realized that the gods had artwork that was universally good at representing them to a modern audience, so there was nothing to talk about. Instead, I decided to contrast the original image of the gods with modern depictions of them. As far as we can tell from the Neolithic up until very recently, depictions of the gods within the 3 classic Age of Mythology cultures consisted of making an idealized version of a man or a woman and assigning fetish objects to them based on their domain, like giving a lightning bolt to Zeus or a hammer to Thor. The Egyptians did the same thing, except their gods were usually associated with an animal, and so they designed them with an animal's head. The Germanic gods were powerful bearded men and beautiful women, though the physical evidence for this was mostly lost. According to hearsay, Odin was an old man with a spear and was missing an eye. Thor had a hammer, red hair, and a girdle. Freyr had a big wiener that Loki claimed his sister enjoyed, and Tyr was missing a hand. They were even more humanoid than the Greeks. The giants, elves, dwarves, Aesir, and Vanir almost all looked like regular humans. I can stretch out a scientific connection here. If we assume that these gods were created from the Big Bang and went on to reproduce and create humanity, we all know how incestuous Greek mythology is, but I would actually say that's a misnomer. The more correct term would be that it's line breeding. The complete lack of genetic diversity amongst the gods would make it more akin to cloning, like with plants, where you can make a clone of a plant and have the male and female clones sexually reproduce. Gaia gave birth to Uranus asexually and then sexually produced 18 children with him. 1 son and daughter paired up and had 6 children, then their son and daughter paired up. So the major gods are going to look the same because they are genetically clones of Uranus or Gaia, kind of like Metal Gear and all the clones of Big Boss. The creatures they created, like centaurs or horses, would instead be the result of genetic engineering. It's kinda romantic that you could have all these characters who are clones of one another, but develop radically different personalities. But it also means you would need different fetish objects to differentiate these gods from one another. Since they all had the same face, this also applies to Germanic and Egyptian gods. If you read their mythology, it similarly starts with a population bottleneck. Egyptian gods didn't actually have animal heads on human bodies. Those were how they were presented in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The animals were their sacred fetishes. Hence why Isis and Nephthys are human-looking. Anyways, with modern depictions, we've moved towards making the gods much more distinct. Which is fine, they're all fictional characters. In fact, while I was doing research for this script, I found some Netflix slop called Blood of Zeus, where all the goddesses do have the same face and it looks terrible. But for 2 gods in particular, Ares and Hades, I don't think I have ever seen a modern interpretation that lines up accurately with their classic design. Hades originally looked like Zeus with a dog instead of lightning, because he was Zeus's older, just as inbred brother. But he has been made into a more hellish style aligned with Christian imagery of the underworld, which is ironic because, as previously established, he looks the same as Zeus, and Zeus was used as the basis for God in Christian artwork. But the Christian version of God is basically an omnipotent domestic abuser who has brainwashed his battered wife, the Christian, that she can't even think about his true nature as the master of hell, demons, and suffering. So they have to assign guilt for the negative aspects of their God to one of his servants. Long story short, the true master of the Christian underworld is God, and God looks like Zeus or Hades. Ares, on the other hand, requires more explanation. According to some of the accounts of Ares, he was a bloodthirsty war god, associated with barbarians, violent emotions, and fire. which is what you will always see focused on in his design, from God of War to Percy Jackson. But originally, the civilizations who actually worshipped Ares depicted him as a handsome, beardless young man. Ares was a war god, but that wasn't his only domain. He covered a full spectrum of powerful emotions related to war, but also sex and romance. That is why Aphrodite chose him out of all the gods. This also fits with Greek mythology, since their most important narrative, the Trojan War, was a war caused by human sexual passion spurred on by Aphrodite. The Greeks also didn't like Ares and only worshipped him to keep him placated, as he was in competition with the patron goddess of their most important city. There were probably cultural and militaristic reasons for this too. The Virgin Athena represented strategy and wore heavy armor, at a time when the Greeks emphasized the hoplite phalanx as their main fighting force. But the Chad Ares was more popular in Thrace, where they used the peltast as their primary fighting force, wearing little to no armor, fighting in a scattered formation like their sexy naked war god, and emphasizing the emotional state of warfare, such as demoralizing or provoking your enemy into breaking their shield wall by throwing javelins at them, so you could exploit the confusion to overcome a superior armored enemy. It's sort of like they used mythology to justify their military doctrine. There's even one story where Athena guided the spear of a man to injure Ares on the fields of Troy. Teamwork makes the dream work, at least when you're in a phalanx. Ares was also actively worshipped alongside Athena in Macedon, and more importantly, Rome, where Mars was the mythological father of the city's founder, Romulus, and his niece was called Minerva. It just so happens that both of those cultures also had armies that used the phalanx and the peltast. The Macedonians with their famous foot companions and the peltasts, and the Romans with the hastati and the triarii. Not in Sparta, though. There is no evidence the Spartans worshipped Ares as a major god, and they certainly placed more importance on Athena. It's like how the Russians only fetishized their army with commanders like Zhukov because their air force and navy were a joke, while the United States dominates every branch of the military with guys like Patton, Abrams, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Bradley, Ridgway, Puller, Doolittle, Lee May, Nimitz, and Zumwalt, and consequently follow a doctrine of full-spectrum dominance. Another meme, like rabbits eating carrots, is to depict Zeus and Poseidon with white hair, when they originally had dark hair. The marble sculptures we see were painted originally, but it wore off over years of neglect. Of course, their big beards make them look like Santa Claus, so I can see why you might get confused. It's actually probably got more to do with the Germanic pantheon. One unique aspect of Odin is that he is actually supposed to look like an elderly man with a big beard. So migrations by the Goths and the Lombards introduced an elderly-looking supreme deity with white hair from their pre-Christian traditions, and then we retroactively applied that to Zeus. They do actually make a nod to that with God of War, because Zeus has white hair even as a baby, but Poseidon and Hera have dark hair even though they're older than him. Another divergence in Edgelord of War, Hephaestus being ugly, is a cultural relic of the Greeks. They considered him to be ugly because of his limp, since that is something they would commit infanticide over, not because he was actually unpleasant to look at. Any classic artwork of him doesn't make him any less handsome than his contemporaries, depending on your opinion on male facial hair. Maybe the developers did know that, which is why you don't see Hephaestus before he was tortured by Zeus. But they also called Heracles Hercules, so the gaps in their knowledge are pretty egregious. So there you have it. The pagan gods in the West were generic beautiful people who needed fetish objects or animals from their myths so you could tell them apart, while modern artists made them generally less human and more cartoonish to fit their needs. Now, with that out of the way, let's finally talk about Age of Mythology. For the most part, I think the portraits in Retold are great. The Egyptian portraits lean onto a recognizable motif. The alternative would be to make them human with fetish objects related to their animals, like Hera wearing a peacock feather cloak. Also, Sobek's design is inconsistent because he is an anthropomorphic crocodile, instead of a man with an animal head like the other Egyptian gods. Basically, he's a lizardman saurus working for the Tomb Kings. The Norse look accurate to their characters, except for Skadi, who isn't traditionally depicted as an ice queen. Also, Hel is half flesh and half blue, so if anything, she should look like Skadi on her dead side, not a mummy. Freyr is also wearing trousers, but conveniently he wields an antler from one of his myths, which is a symbol of a stag's fertility, so they could use it as a stand-in for his scanned dingo. There is a near-universal emphasis on Western beauty standards in modern art, so I can't really fault them for making Greek and Egyptian gods look like they're Norse gods, cosplaying as Greeks and Egyptians. Hephaestus's beardless appearance fits well. It allows the details of his rugged appearance as a blacksmith to be made more visible, though I wish it was consistent with his 5 brothers. Also, he should probably have a leather apron. Ares, I would have emphasized the fertility god aspect more by following closely to classical art. Give him less armor and a softer appearance to contrast with Hephaestus. Maybe have Eros with him like that one sculpture, or his 3 children his texts are named after hanging out with him. Aphrodite is interesting because she is made to stand out with her red hair. In this context, it's probably because red hair is a symbol of sexuality going back to the original artwork from Ensemble Studios. But in an alternate world, it could have been used to hint at her connection to Levantine and Mesopotamian fertility deities by giving her Asian features, since red hair was also associated with foreigners by the Greeks. And there were redheads in the ancient Near East. Honestly, since everyone who looks human in the Greek and Atlantean pantheon is Northern European looking, you could just base Aphrodite's facial features on a Greek supermodel, which would make her look foreign by contrast. Also, Apollo has blonde hair and Artemis has brown hair like Luke and Leia, though in this case their blonde hair is from their mother Leto, and Artemis was the one whose hair changed color, getting darker as she aged, where the Star Wars twins were dark-haired as babies and Luke's hair turned blonde, possibly from inheriting genes from unspecified ancestors to Anakin and Padme, or maybe from a lifetime of exposure to the twin sons of Tatooine. Now, as for the major gods, one of the things I did notice was that Poseidon has much longer hair than Zeus. This is probably just an aesthetic choice. Maybe his hair is supposed to flow like water. But during the time of the Mycenaeans, Poseidon was the king of the gods, and the Mycenaeans nobles wore their hair long like that, while the shorter hair of Zeus was associated with the nobility of the classical era. Hades is hard to tell because he is wearing the helmet of invisibility, but he might have a beard with no mustache, which was a style common with Spartans during the classical era. But I don't like much of anything with this version of Hades, and it could just as well be that he has a chin strap like edgelord Kratos. I would redesign Hades completely. First off, I would remove the hellish imagery and instead focus on his connection to the earth and wealth. According to Greek myth, an anvil would have to fall 9 days from Hades to reach the pits of Tartarus. Cerberus guarded the entrance to the underworld, while Elysium and Asphodel are Viridian, and there's nothing to say that the rivers were made of magma, except for maybe Phlegethon. If you wanted to have any magma, you should have set Hephaestus's portrait in a volcano or something, since that is his domain. So give Hades gold and jewels, maybe inlaid with his weapons and armor or the palace in the background. Have it set in a meadow in spring. This would provide a connection to his wife Persephone and be more accurate to the Greek image of the underworld. As a secondary function, the green would contrast the white stone of Olympus for Zeus and the blue of the ocean for Poseidon. As for his face and skin, give him the same skin tone as his brothers or lighter. Now I would diverge from the classic artwork by making Hades clean-shaven with short hair, in line with the fashion of the nobility during the Hellenistic and Roman era, where Hades became more important through his syncretism with Serapis and Pluto. I would do this in part to represent 3 different eras and the style of warfare associated with those eras during Greek history, and to scrub Hades of the edgelord of war look. First, you have Poseidon, the lord of horses during the Mycenaean era, when chariots dominated the battlefield. Then you have Zeus during the classical era, where cavalry served a supporting role to the infantry. Finally, Hades during the Hellenistic and Roman era, where siege engines and artillery became more prominent. And Hades got some respect as the Wario of the Greek pantheon. Now, as for the Atlantean gods, the thing about the Atlanteans is that Cronus and Gaia are depicted as elementals. I don't like it, because it doesn't align with the art style of the rest of the Atlantean gods. In fact, Gaia was human-looking with her original portrait, but they made her into a Spriggan for Retold. I think the reason they did this is because at the end of the campaign for the Titans, you summon Gaia as a giant lady wearing leaves for a kaiju fight against Cronus, and they wanted something that visually contrasted Cronus as a giant rock monster after King Kong versus Godzilla. I wouldn't mind if all the Atlantean gods were elementals, but it's only those two, so they look out of place. I also think if they wanted to go this route, they should have just given the Atlanteans unique titans based on their major gods, which is where those designs would actually work. Additionally, Oceanus is depicted as a fishman. He would look basically identical with Poseidon if he wasn't a fishman, but you could just change around his fetish objects to make him distinct. Helios, Prometheus, Hephaestus, and Ares are all associated with fire, but you can immediately tell them apart based on their portraits. And it also make him inconsistent with the rest of the gods. Overall, the only offensive thing about the depiction of the Greek gods in Age of Mythology is the fact Cronus was the bad guy, and not a subversive anti-villain character who is the antagonist for the sake of the plot. All of his children, except for Hestia, turned out to be assholes. Heck, even in the game's story, they basically just abandon the Atlanteans and drive them to Titan worship. I think that about wraps it up with my thoughts on the modern depictions of the gods today. If you take away anything from this, I hope it's that, like the ancients who created these gods, you can use both overt and subtle artistic design language in order to convey your point to your audience, to create characters that are both beautiful, powerful, and most importantly flawed and human. Until next time, this has been Divest.